Before Adam, what existed? That's the question no one asked in the 17th century, because the answer was already given. It was in the Bible. It was in the mouths of rabbis. It was protected by bonfires and excommunications. Adam was the first man. God created him from clay, breathed life into him, and everything began there in Eden, between the forbidden tree and the serpent. Simple as that, but Baruch Spinoza looked at this story and saw something no one else saw. He saw a lie. Not a malicious lie, not a conspiracy, but a necessary lie told by generations that needed order, meaning a God who loved and punished them in the right measure. Spinoza asked, what if Adam never existed? What if man was not created by a divine breath, but emerged from nature itself like everything else? What if God never spoke to Moses, never chose a people, never wrote commandments on stone? What if all this is just a human interpretation of forces they don't understand? This question cost dearly. It cost his community. It cost his family. It cost his name. At 23 years old, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish synagogue with a curse that few men in history received. They couldn't speak to him. They couldn't read his writings. They couldn't even be under the same roof. He became a living ghost. And even so, he didn't stop, because Spinoza had something more dangerous than courage. He had clarity. What you're going to hear now is not theology. It's not modern science disguised as philosophy. It's the most radical attempt in history to answer a simple question. Where did we come from? But Spinoza didn't answer like the religious, who say, from God. And he didn't answer like scientists who say, from evolution. He answered as a philosopher. And his answer was this: we came from the single eternal substance that is everything that exists. From this substance that doesn't think, doesn't choose, doesn't judge. That just is. And that produces everything, stars, stones, plants, animals, men, by the same necessity with which 2 + 2 = 4. There is no purpose. There is no fall. There is no salvation. There is only existence. And within this existence there is man, not created in God's image, but generated by the same laws that generate wheat, wind, and wolf. Is this liberating, or is it the most absolute solitude? Spinoza would say it's the truth, and truth is not here to console us. It's here to free us from the illusions that bind us. So prepare yourself, because what comes next will dismantle, piece by piece, everything you learned about the origin of man. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with the icy precision of one who sees the world as it is. Welcome to the natural genesis of man, according to Spinoza. The story that should have changed everything, and that perhaps still will. Spinoza was born in 1632, son of a Jewish family that had fled the Portuguese Inquisition. He grew up among synagogues, sacred texts, and the promise that God had a plan for his people, a special plan, an eternal covenant. But from early on, something inside him didn't fit. He read the Torah and saw contradictions. He heard the rabbis and noticed that their explanations didn't solve the problems, they just hid them under layers of interpretation. At 17, Spinoza was already considered a prodigy. He mastered Hebrew, Latin, Spanish, Portuguese. He studied rabbinic commentaries with mastery. But while the other students marveled at the wisdom of the ancients, Spinoza began to doubt. Not with arrogance, not with adolescent rebellion, but with a methodical, philosophical, inevitable doubt. He looked at Genesis and wondered, how can an infinite and perfect God create the world in 6 days? Why 6? Why days? Isn't time a human creation, a way to organize experience? And if God is eternal, how can there be a before and after for him? And if God is immutable, how can he decide to create something new, something that didn't exist before? These questions had no answer, or rather, they had ready-made answers, memorized, repeated for generations. But Spinoza didn't want ready-made answers. He wanted to understand. And the more he understood, the more he realized that the story of Adam wasn't history. It was allegory. It was myth. It was a way that ancient peoples found to explain the inexplicable. Why do we exist? Why do we suffer? Why do we die? And their answer was simple: because Adam disobeyed, because he ate the forbidden fruit, because he chose knowledge over obedience. And since then, all humanity carries this original guilt, this sin that stains the soul even before we're born. But Spinoza couldn't accept this, not because he was too optimistic, not because he wanted to absolve humanity, but because this explanation simply didn't make sense. If God is omniscient, he knew Adam would disobey. If he knew and still created Adam, then disobedience was part of the plan. And if it was part of the plan, it wasn't disobedience. It was necessity. It was destiny. It was the only thing that could have happened. And if it was necessity, there was no guilt, no fall, no original sin. There was only human nature manifesting exactly as it should manifest, just as water flows downward, just as fire burns, just as stone falls, not by choice, not by free will, but by natural necessity. This idea was dangerous, more dangerous than any heresy the Inquisition had ever burned, because if there's no guilt, there's no redemption. If there's no fall, there's no salvation. If there's no sin, there's no need for priests, temples, rituals, sacrifices. The entire structure of religion collapses, and with it, the entire power structure that sustains itself on this religion. Spinoza knew this. He knew he was treading on forbidden territory, but he couldn't stop. Because for him, truth was more important than safety, clarity was more important than acceptance, and philosophy was more important than faith. At 20, he began frequenting circles of freethinkers. Dissident Christians, Mennonites, collegiants, people who also doubted, who also questioned, who also sought something beyond ready-made answers. And it was there, in those secret conversations, in those heated debates, that Spinoza began to formulate his radical vision of the origin of man. He realized that the problem wasn't just in the story of Adam, the problem was in the very idea of creation, because creating implies choice, implies that God could have created or not created, could have created one way or another, could have made a different world with different rules, with different beings, and if he chose this specific world, then he had reasons for it. He had preferences. He had will. But a God with will is a limited God, because will only exists where there are alternatives, only exists where something can be one way or another. And if God is infinite, if he is perfect, if he is absolute, then there are no alternatives for him. There is only necessity. There is only what is, and what is couldn't be otherwise. So God didn't create the world. The world isn't a divine work of art, shaped by celestial hands according to a loving project. The world is a necessary consequence of God's very existence. Or rather, the world is God expressing himself. It's the single infinite substance manifesting in infinite forms, infinite modes, infinite particular existences. And one of these particular existences is man, not created in God's image, not endowed with an immortal soul, not separated from nature by a metaphysical abyss, but part of nature, mode of substance, finite expression of the infinite. Spinoza wrote these ideas in secret notebooks. He didn't dare publish them yet. He knew he would be destroyed if he did, but he couldn't stay silent, couldn't pretend he believed, couldn't participate in rituals, prayers, celebrations, knowing that all of it was, at best, a mistaken interpretation of reality, and at worst, a tool of social control. The rabbis began to note that Spinoza asked too many questions, that he doubted too much, that he distanced himself from traditional practices. They called him for conversations, offered him money to be silent, to feign orthodoxy, to not spread his dangerous ideas. But Spinoza refused, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but because he couldn't live a lie. And then came the Excommunication. On July 27, 1656, in the Amsterdam synagogue, the leaders of the Jewish community read the cherem, the decree of expulsion, and it wasn't an ordinary excommunication. It was the most severe on record. The words were these: "By the decrees of the angels and by the words of the saints, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and condemn Baruch Spinoza. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he enters. May the Lord never forgive him. May the wrath and fury of the Lord burn against this man, and cast upon him all the curses written in the book of the law. And you who remain faithful to the Lord your God, be all alive today." Spinoza was 23 years old. He was banished, erased, treated as if he were dead. No one from the community could speak to him, help him, read his writings, even approach within 4 cubits of him. But he did not repent, did not ask for forgiveness, did not beg to return, simply moved forward, moved out of the city, began working as a lens grinder to earn a living, and continued thinking, writing, developing his philosophy. And it was in this forced isolation that Spinoza formulated his most radical theory about the origin of man. A theory that didn't depend on Adam, that didn't need Eden, that didn't resort to original sin to explain the human condition. A theory that saw man as an inseparable part of nature, subject to the same laws that govern everything else. For Spinoza, asking where did man come from was like asking where did the storm come from, or where did the mountain come from? The answer isn't in a divine creative act. It's in the laws of nature. It's in the necessity with which things produce one another, in an infinite causal chain without beginning and without end. Man was not created. Man emerged, arose, came to be. By the same natural necessity with which water evaporates, forms clouds and falls as rain. There's no miracle in this, no supernatural intervention. There's only nature doing what nature does, existing, transforming itself, producing infinite forms of life and death. And this vision, however cold it may seem, had an unexpected consequence. It freed man. Because if there's no fall, there's no guilt. If there's no guilt, there's no need for redemption. If there's no need for redemption, man is free to live according to his own nature, without fear of eternal punishment, without hope of celestial reward, free to seek joy, knowledge, fulfillment, here and now, in this life, which is the only one we have. Spinoza was not a man of violent revolutions. He didn't preach in squares, didn't summon crowds, didn't write inflammatory pamphlets. His revolution was silent, made with ink, paper, and the surgical precision of one who dissects millennial concepts to reveal what lies behind them. And what he found behind the story of Adam was something disturbing. Fear. Fear of death. Fear of the unknown. Fear of having no purpose. Fear of being alone in an indifferent universe. And to combat this fear, humanity invented narratives. Narratives that would explain why we're here, why we suffer, why we die. And the narrative of Adam was perfect for this. Simple, didactic, consoling in its own way. You suffer because someone sinned. You die because someone disobeyed. But if you obey, if you follow the rules, if you believe, you will be saved. Death won't be the end. There will be something after, something better. Spinoza looked at this narrative and saw its utility, saw why it worked, why it spread, why it survived millennia. But he also saw its falsehood, because it didn't explain reality. It just coated it with a layer of artificial meaning. And Spinoza wasn't interested in artificial meaning. He was interested in naked, raw, implacable truth. So he began to write the Ethics, his masterpiece, a book that would take almost 20 years to complete, and that would only be published after his death, because no one would dare publish it while he was alive. The Ethics wasn't just a philosophical treatise. It was a frontal attack on everything religion taught about God, man, and the world, and it began with a devastating proposition. There exists only one substance, a single fundamental reality, and this substance is God, or if you prefer, it's nature, because for Spinoza, God and nature are the same thing. This sounded like blasphemy to Christians, sounded like heresy to Jews, sounded like disguised atheism to everyone. But Spinoza wasn't denying God. He was redefining God. He was saying that God is not a personal being who observes us from heaven, who judges us, who intervenes in history. God is the totality of what exists, is the single substance from which everything is made, is the immanent force that runs through every atom, every star, every living being. And if God is nature, then everything that happens is divine, not in the sense of being good or sacred, but in the sense of being necessary, of being expression of the infinite substance. The storm that destroys the harvest is divine. The predator that devours the prey is divine. The disease that kills the child is divine. Not because God wants these things, but because God is these things. God is the entire process. God is the blind necessity with which nature operates. And man is also divine, also a mode of substance, also necessary expression of the infinite. But he's not special. He's not the center of creation. He wasn't made in God's image in a moral or spiritual sense. He was made from the same laws that make the stone, the worm, the ocean, and he's subject to the same necessities. Here Spinoza did something revolutionary. He removed man from the pedestal, removed the idea that we are different, superior, separated from the rest of nature by an immortal soul or divine spark. We are nature, just nature, complex, yes, conscious, yes, but no less natural than the tree or the river. And if we're just nature, then the story of Adam can't be true, because Adam, according to Genesis, was created directly by God, molded from clay, animated by a divine breath. He was placed in Eden, a place outside nature, an artificial paradise where there was no death, no pain, no need. And only after the fall, after sin, did Adam become mortal, subject to suffering, part of the natural world. But for Spinoza, this was absurd. There's no place outside nature. There's no state prior to mortality. There's no paradise from which we fell. We were always mortal. We were always subject to pain. We were always part of the incessant flow of birth, growth, decay, and death that characterizes all finite existence. So Adam, if he existed, was not the first man. He was just a man, one among many. And the story of his special creation, of his fall, of his expulsion from paradise, was a metaphor, a poetic way of expressing the human condition, the consciousness we have of our finitude, the perception that we know we're going to die, the anguish this generates, and the need to find meaning, purpose, justification for this brief and fragile existence. Spinoza didn't despise this need. He understood it, felt it in himself, but he refused to satisfy it with consoling lies. He preferred hard truth to comfortable illusion, and the truth for him was this: man was not created, man became, through natural processes, through the same necessity that transforms seed into tree, that transforms cloud into rain, that transforms stardust into planet. How exactly this happened, Spinoza didn't know. He didn't have the knowledge of evolutionary biology that emerged centuries later, but he had the philosophical intuition that life didn't need divine intervention to arise. It needed only time, adequate conditions, the blind operation of natural laws. And once life arose, it diversified, it complexified, and at some point in this complexification, something new emerged: consciousness, the capacity to perceive oneself, to think about thinking, to question one's own existence. And with consciousness came the unique suffering of the human being, the suffering of knowing we're finite, of knowing we're going to die, of knowing that everything we love, everything we build, everything we are, will one day cease to exist. This is the true original sin, not Adam's disobedience, but human consciousness, the curse and the blessing of knowing too much, of seeing beyond the present moment, of projecting oneself into the future and past, of imagining possibilities, of desiring things we don't have, of fearing things that haven't happened yet. And that's why we create stories, stories like Adam's, stories that tell us there's meaning behind suffering, that death is not the end, that there's justice, reward, redemption. These stories aren't useless. They fulfill an important psychological function. They help people endure the unendurable, to continue living even knowing they're going to die. But Spinoza believed we could do better. We could face truth without falling apart. We could live without the crutches of religious illusions. We could find joy, fulfillment, even a form of eternity, not in a future heaven, but here, now, in adequate understanding of our own nature and of the nature of the whole. And here he distanced himself both from the religious and from superficial atheists, because the religious said, there is God, and God loves us, and there's life after death. And atheists said, there is no God, there's no meaning, we're just cosmic dust destined to disappear. But Spinoza said, there is God, but God is not what you think. God is everything, and because God is everything, we are God. We are finite modes of the infinite substance. We are waves in the ocean, and when the wave dissolves, it doesn't disappear. It returns to the ocean. It was always in the ocean. This is not personal immortality. Spinoza didn't believe his individual consciousness would survive death, didn't believe in resurrection, in reincarnation, in heaven or hell, but he believed in something deeper. He believed that the essence of what we are, the substance from which we're made, is eternal, always was, always will be. And the more we understand this, the more we identify with this eternal substance, instead of with our finite and passing self, the freer we become from fear of death. This was the path Spinoza proposed, Not a path of faith, not a path of obedience, but a path of knowledge, of rational understanding of reality, of intellectual love of God, which for him meant love of truth, love of the totality of what exists, love of the necessity with which everything happens. And to walk this path, it was necessary to abandon Adam, abandon the idea that we were created specially, that there's a divine plan for us, that we're the center of the universe. We needed to accept our smallness, our cosmic insignificance, and paradoxically it was precisely by accepting this that we became free, because we stopped expecting the universe to owe us something. We stopped resenting God for not giving us what we want. We stopped living like spoiled children demanding attention from a celestial Father, and we began to live as adults, as autonomous beings, as conscious parts of nature that don't need external justifications for their existence. That simply exist as the tree exists, as the star exists, without purpose beyond existing. Now I need to ask you something, because you've come this far. You've gone through Spinoza's Excommunication. You've gone through the demolition of Adam. You've gone through the radical redefinition of God. And I know this isn't easy. This messes with everything we were taught, with everything that comforts us. So tell me, what do you think Spinoza lost by abandoning Adam, freedom, or just illusions? Think about it, because what comes next goes even deeper. We're going to enter the mechanics of human nature according to Spinoza, into instincts, into passions, into reason, and you're going to see that his vision of what we are is perhaps more disturbing than everything we've seen so far. If you want to continue, if you want to see where this line of thought leads, then stay, because Spinoza doesn't stop, and neither will we. The great question that remained was this: if man was not created by God in his image, if there's no immortal soul breathed by a loving creator, if we're just finite modes of the infinite substance, then what exactly are we? What moves us? What makes us act, think, desire, suffer, love? Spinoza answered with one word: conatus. In Latin, conatus means effort, impulse, tendency. And for Spinoza, conatus is the essence of every being. It's the effort that each thing makes to persevere in its existence. The stone doesn't want to disintegrate, the plant doesn't want to die, the animal doesn't want to be devoured, and man doesn't want to cease existing. This impulse is not a choice, it's not a conscious decision, it's the very nature of being, it's what defines what it means to be alive. And here Spinoza did something radical again. He didn't see conatus as something given by God. He saw it as a necessary consequence of existence. If you exist, you tend to continue existing. This is not mystery, not miracle, it's pure logic. Because if something didn't tend to persevere, it would simply cease to exist in the first instant. The fact that things last, that they resist dissolution, that they fight against entropy, is proof that conatus is operating. In man, conatus manifests in a complex way. It manifests as desire, as will, as this constant restlessness that makes us seek pleasures, avoid pains, accumulate resources, form alliances, reproduce, create, build. All this is conatus. All this is the fundamental effort to remain being. But Spinoza didn't see desire as something negative, as many religious traditions did. He didn't see desire as the source of sin, as something that needs to be mortified, suppressed, transcended. He saw desire as the very essence of life. To suppress desire would be to suppress life, would be to go against nature. And to go against nature, for Spinoza, wasn't virtue, it was insanity. So the path wasn't to deny desire, it was to understand it. It was to understand which desires strengthen us and which weaken us, which increase our power of acting and which diminish it. Because not all desire is equal. Some desires are born from our own nature, from adequate understanding of what we are and what the world is. Other desires are born from ignorance, from confusion, from inadequate ideas we have about ourselves and about reality. And this is where Spinoza's fundamental distinction between passions and actions came in. When we're moved by inadequate ideas, by confused perceptions, by distorted imaginations of reality, we're in a state of passion. We're passive. We're acted upon more than we act. We're like leaves in the wind, carried by external forces we don't understand and don't control. But when we're moved by adequate ideas, by rational understanding, by clear knowledge of the causal chain that constitutes us, then we're in a state of action. We're active. We're cause of our own movements. And this is freedom. Not freedom in the sense of free will, of capacity to choose between equally possible alternatives, but freedom in the sense of self-determination, of acting according to our own nature instead of being determined by poorly understood external causes. And what does this have to do with the origin of man, everything? Because if we understand that man was not created with a fixed nature, with an immutable essence given by God, but rather emerged from natural processes and continues being molded by these processes, then we understand that there's no ideal human nature from which we fell. There's no state of original perfection that we lost with Adam's sin. What there is a real concrete human nature, formed by millions of years of natural processes, a nature that includes conatus, the desire to persevere, a nature that includes the capacity to form ideas, to imagine, to reason, a nature that includes joyful and sad passions, love and hate, hope and fear, compassion and envy. All this is natural. All this emerges from the laws of nature applied to beings like us. And if it's natural, it's not sin. It's not fall. It's not something we need to repent of or redeem ourselves from. It's simply what we are. And the task is not to deny what we are. It's to understand what we are, to live better, to suffer less, to increase our power to exist and to act. Spinoza saw primitive human beings, those who arose long before Adam, long before civilizations, long before religions, as beings completely dominated by passions, dominated by immediate fear of the predator, by hunger, by need for shelter, by sexual drive. There was no reflection in them, no morality, no consciousness of good and evil in the sense we give to these terms. But these beings had something, the impulse to form groups, because solitary beings are weak, are vulnerable, and conatus drove them to unite, to cooperate, to create rudimentary forms of society, not out of goodness, not out of love for neighbor, but out of necessity, out of primitive calculation that together they survive better than alone. And from this cooperation, forced by necessity, emerged the first norms, the first rules. Don't do this because it weakens the group. Do that because it strengthens the group. And whoever followed the rules was rewarded. Whoever broke them was punished. Thus, morality was born, not from a divine commandment, not from an eternal law inscribed in the human heart, but from practical agreements between beings who needed each other to survive. And then something interesting emerged. These rules, initially purely utilitarian, began to be internalized, began to be felt as right or wrong, not just as useful or harmful, and moral consciousness was born. The feeling of guilt when we violate norms, the feeling of pride when we follow them, the feeling of indignation when we see others violate them. All this was natural. All this was result of social evolutionary processes, but people didn't understand this. They didn't have the knowledge to understand. So they created supernatural explanations. They created the idea that rules came from God, that there was an objective, eternal, universal moral law, that good and evil were metaphysical categories, not human constructions, and they created Adam. They created the story of a first man who knew good and evil, who was tested, who failed, who fell, and they made this story the basis of all Western morality, the basis of the idea of sin, of guilt, of need for redemption. But for Spinoza, this story was unnecessary. Worse, it was harmful, because it made people believe they were inherently corrupted, inherently evil, inherently separated from God by an original guilt for which they had no responsibility, but for which they were punished. This generated neurotic guilt, generated self-hatred, generated unnecessary submission to religious authorities who promised salvation. The truth, according to Spinoza, was much simpler and much more liberating. There is no original sin. There is only human nature, and human nature includes tendencies both for cooperation and for conflict, both for reason and for passion, both for joy and for sadness. We're not fallen angels. We're not disguised demons. We're just rational animals trying to survive in an indifferent universe. And morality? Morality is useful. It's necessary, but it's not divine. It's human. It's a tool we developed to live better together. And like every tool, it can be used well or badly, can be perfected or distorted, can serve us or enslave us. Religions, according to Spinoza, had transformed morality into slavery, had made it a control system based on fear of eternal punishment and hope of eternal reward, and this worked to maintain social order, to keep people obedient, to keep power structures intact, but it didn't lead to true virtue, didn't lead to true freedom. It led only to mechanical obedience, to suppression of desires, to diminished life. True virtue for Spinoza was born from understanding, that our good is linked to the good of others, not because God so orders, not because we'll be rewarded in heaven, but because we're part of the same substance, we're modes of the same immanent God, and what affects one affects all. It's impossible to be truly happy in an unhappy society. It's impossible to be truly free in a slave society. So the pursuit of virtue is the pursuit of knowledge. It's the pursuit of adequate understanding of ourselves, of others, of the world. And the more we understand, the freer we become, more capable of acting according to our own nature, more capable of experiencing genuine joys instead of passing pleasures, more capable of forming relationships based on rational love instead of emotional dependence. And here Spinoza reached a surprising conclusion. The wise man, the free man, the virtuous man is not one who denies his desires. It's one who understands his desires, who knows which to pursue and which to abandon, who acts with internal necessity, not with external obedience, who is adequate cause of his own actions. This man doesn't need Adam, doesn't need a full story to explain why he sometimes acts badly. He knows he acts badly when he acts from inadequate ideas, from confused passions, from ignorance about himself and about the world. And he knows the solution isn't to repent, isn't to flagellate himself, isn't to beg divine forgiveness. The solution is to understand, is to learn, is to grow in knowledge until the passions that enslaved him lose their power. This is not easy. Spinoza didn't promise ease, he promised truth. And the truth is that most men live enslaved to passions, live in ignorance, live seeking pleasures that don't satisfy and fleeing pains they don't understand. And it's for these men that religion serves. It's for them that Adam serves, as an educational story, as a way to give meaning to suffering, as a promise that there's something better after. But for those who can bear the truth, for those who can live without these crutches, there's another path, the path of knowledge, the path of rational freedom, the path that Spinoza walked, and that cost him everything, family, community, security, but that gave him something no religion could give. The peace that comes from knowing you don't need to be saved because you were never lost, that you don't need redemption because you never fell, that you are exactly what you should be, a finite mode of the infinite substance, expressing itself according to its nature, by necessity, without guilt and without regret. But there was a problem, a huge problem that Spinoza couldn't ignore. If everything is necessary, if everything happens by strict causal determination, if there's no free will in the traditional sense, then where does responsibility lie? How can we blame someone for their actions if they couldn't have acted otherwise? How can we praise virtue or condemn vice if both are just necessary expressions of nature? This question tormented Spinoza's readers, still torments, because it seems he's destroying the basis of all morality. If we're not free, if we're just pieces in a deterministic cosmic mechanism, then it doesn't matter whether we're good or bad, doesn't matter whether we kill or save, doesn't matter whether we build or destroy. Everything is equally necessary, equally natural, equally devoid of intrinsic moral value. But Spinoza had an answer, and it was a subtle, difficult answer that required thinking completely differently about morality and responsibility. He said, "It's true that everything is necessary. It's true that each action is determined by the nature of the agent and by external circumstances. It's true that given who you are and where you are, you couldn't act differently than you act. But this doesn't mean all actions are equivalent, doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Because some actions flow from adequate ideas, from rational understanding, from well-constituted nature, and other actions flow from inadequate ideas, from confused passions, from poorly constituted nature. The former increase our power of acting, the latter diminish it. The former bring us closer to freedom, the latter sink us into slavery. So there is criterion for judgment, not an absolute criterion, engraved in stone, dictated by God, but an immanent criterion based on the very nature of things. Actions that increase our power are good, actions that diminish it are bad. Simple as that. Not because a divine legislator so decided, but because it's in the nature of goodness to increase power and in the nature of badness to diminish it. and responsibility. We're responsible not in the sense that we could have chosen differently, but in the sense that our actions flow from our nature, and our nature can be transformed, can be educated, can be perfected by knowledge. So when we punish someone, we're not avenging a badly made free choice. We're trying to modify that person's nature so that in the future they act differently. This changes everything, changes how we see criminals, changes how we see sinners, changes how we see ourselves when we fail. There's no metaphysical guilt, there's no stain on the soul, there's only ignorance, there's only poorly understood passions, there's only nature acting as it must act given the circumstances, and if we want to change behavior, it's no use appealing to free will. It's no use saying, you should have chosen differently, because there was no choice. It's useful to educate. It's useful to show the consequences of actions. It's useful to help the person form more adequate ideas about themselves and about the world. Because when ideas change, actions change, necessarily, automatically. Spinoza applied this to the story of Adam devastatingly. According to Genesis, Adam freely chose to disobey God, chose to eat the forbidden fruit, and for this free choice he was punished, was expelled from paradise, and all humanity was punished with him. This seems fair within the logic of free will. If Adam was free, if he could have chosen differently, then he deserves punishment, and we, his descendants, inherit his guilt. But for Spinoza, this was absurd. First, because Adam wasn't free. He was determined by his nature and by circumstances. If he had a tendency to desire knowledge, if the serpent was persuasive, if the fruit was attractive, then he necessarily ate the fruit. There was no real alternative. There was only the illusion of alternative that comes from not knowing all the causes that determine our actions. Second, because punishing Adam eternally for a determined action is unjust. It's like punishing water for flowing downward. It's like punishing fire for burning. It's treating natural necessity as if it were moral transgression. And third, because making all humanity inherit Adam's guilt is even more unjust. It's punishing billions of people for something they didn't do, that they didn't choose, that happened long before they existed. This is not justice, it's arbitrary cruelty disguised as divine justice. So the whole narrative collapses. Adam didn't choose freely. Adam didn't fall. Adam, if he existed, simply acted according to his nature. And his nature, like that of all beings, was determined by the infinite substance manifesting in that particular form, in those particular circumstances. But then why does the story of Adam exist? Why was it created? Why did it survive millennia? Spinoza had an explanation. The story of Adam serves practical purposes. It serves to teach ignorant masses that certain actions have bad consequences. It serves to create social cohesion through a shared narrative. It serves to give simple people an understandable way to think about good and evil, about right and wrong, and Spinoza wasn't against this. He wasn't a revolutionary who wanted to destroy all social institutions. He recognized that most people can't live according to pure reason, need stories, need symbols, need religions that speak to imagination, and effects not just to intellect. The problem wasn't the story of Adam itself. The problem was when this story was taken literally, when it was used to found complex theologies about original sin, divine grace, predestination, salvation, when it was used to control people through fear and guilt, when it became obstacle to knowledge instead of bridge to it. And the problem was especially grave when the story of Adam was used to deny man's nature, to make people believe their desires are sinful, that their body is source of evil, that they must mortify the flesh, deny instincts, live in constant war against themselves. This, for Spinoza, was the true sin, was going against nature, was unnecessarily diminishing the power to live, because man doesn't need to be saved from his nature. He needs to understand his nature. He needs to learn to live according to his nature in a way that increases his joy and decreases his sadness. He needs to develop adequate ideas about himself so he can act with rational freedom instead of being thrown by passions like a ship in a storm. And how to do this? Spinoza had a method. It started with knowledge of the first kind, imaginative knowledge, confused, based on random experiences and hearsay. This is the knowledge of most people. It's knowledge useful for practical life, but insufficient for freedom. Then came knowledge of the second kind, rational knowledge, based on common notions and logical demonstrations. This is the knowledge of science and philosophy. It's knowledge that allows us to understand the causes of things, the laws that govern nature, the necessary connections between events. And finally, for a few, came knowledge of the third kind, which Spinoza called intuitive science, or adequate knowledge of singular essences. It was a form of direct, immediate knowledge of the intimate nature of things. It was seeing each particular thing as necessary mode of the infinite substance. It was experiencing eternity in time, the infinite in the finite. And when someone reached this knowledge, something extraordinary happened. Passions lost their power, fear of death disappeared, envy, hatred, ambition, everything that makes men miserable, dissolved. And something new was born, intellectual love of God. Not love in the sense of emotion directed at a divine person, but love in the sense of understanding and joyful acceptance of the totality of what exists. This love asked for nothing, expected no reward, feared no punishment. It was pure disinterested love that was born simply from seeing things as they are and marveling at the necessity and perfection of the whole. And this love was eternal, not in the sense of lasting forever in time, but in the sense of participating in God's eternity, of being part of something that was never born and will never die. And here Spinoza made his final promise, the promise that replaced religion's promise of salvation. He said, "You don't need to wait to die to experience eternity. You can experience it now. You can feel it in every moment of adequate understanding. You can live it in every act that flows from your own fully realized nature. Eternity is not after. It's within. It's in the very structure of being." But this wasn't for everyone. Spinoza knew this. He knew he was writing for a few, for those capable of enduring a philosophy without easy consolation, without promises of heaven, without personal God who cares about their prayers. He wrote for those who prefer hard truth to sweet lie, for those who can stand alone without the crutches of religious illusions. And for these few the message was clear. You don't need Adam. You don't need fall. You don't need redemption. You need only knowledge, and knowledge is available. It's not hidden in divine revelations. It's not guarded by priests. It's in the very structure of reality, waiting to be discovered by any mind willing to think with clarity and courage. The last years of Spinoza were of growing isolation. He lived in rented rooms, grinding lenses to survive, writing his philosophy in free moments. Few visited him. Few dared to be seen with Europe's most famous heretic, but those who visited him reported the same thing. They found a man at peace, a man without bitterness, without resentment, without fear. This intrigued people. How could someone who lost everything, family, community, prospect of recognition, be at peace? The answer lay in his philosophy. Spinoza hadn't lost anything worth keeping. He'd lost illusions. He'd lost the comfort of social lies. But he'd gained something more valuable, truth. And truth, however cold it may be, has its own kind of beauty, has its own form of consolation. He continued developing his vision of the natural origin of man. In his notebooks, we find reflections on what the first humans must have been like. Crude creatures dominated by instinct, living in small groups, in constant fear of predators, of cold, of hunger, without developed language, without abstract concepts, without notion of time beyond the immediate. But even these primitive beings had conatus, had the impulse to preserve their existence, and this impulse led them to do extraordinary things, led them to use tools, to control fire, to create shelters, to develop increasingly sophisticated forms of communication, not because God taught them, not because they had a special soul, but because the very necessity of surviving forced them to become more intelligent, more cooperative, more adaptable. And at some point in this evolutionary journey, something crucial happened. These beings developed self-consciousness, developed the capacity to see themselves as agents, as subjects, as individuals separate from the environment. And with this consciousness came existential anguish, came the perception of their own finitude, came the fear of death made conscious. Spinoza saw this as the crucial moment in human history, not Adam's creation, not the fall from Eden, but the emergence of self-consciousness, because from this moment the human being became capable of suffering in a way no other animal suffers. capable of anticipating their own death, capable of fearing the future, capable of lamenting the past, capable of feeling inadequate, guilty, ashamed. And it was to deal with this new suffering, this specifically human suffering, that religions arose. They offered explanations for suffering, offered rituals to appease the gods, offered promises of life after death, offered meaning in a world that seemed absurd. And the story of Adam was part of this. It was a brilliant way to explain why humans, unlike animals, feel guilt, why they feel shame about their bodies, why they feel something is wrong with them. The answer was simple: because Adam sinned, because we fell from a state of grace, because we're separated from God by our own guilt. But Spinoza saw this as a mistaken interpretation of real phenomena. It was true that humans felt guilt and shame. It was true they felt something was wrong. But this wasn't result of a metaphysical fall. It was result of living in society, of having internalized social norms, of feeling the conflict between our individual desires and the group's demands. Guilt wasn't original sin. It was socialization. It was the price we pay for living together. And shame about the body wasn't result of having eaten the forbidden fruit. It was result of societies that repressed sexuality, that saw pleasure as sin, that created taboos around natural functions. And Spinoza saw all this as unnecessary, saw it as a layer of suffering added to the inevitable suffering of existence, because it's already hard enough to be mortal. It's already hard enough to know we're going to die, that we're going to lose everything we love. We don't need to add to this the guilt of being what we are. We don't need to add shame for having the desires we have. We don't need to add fear of a divine judgment that will never come because there's no divine judge waiting to punish us. But how to free people from these unnecessary sufferings? Spinoza had no illusions about this. He knew he couldn't convert the masses. He knew most would always live according to imagination, according to passions, according to inherited beliefs. And that was fine, because these people could still live reasonably good lives if they followed religion sensibly, if they used sacred stories as moral guides without taking them to fanaticism. The problem was fanaticism. The problem was those who took scriptures so seriously, they became intolerant, cruel, willing to kill in God's name. These were the truly dangerous. And to combat them, Spinoza wrote his theological political treatise, a work more dangerous than anything he'd written before. In this book, he analyzed scriptures with rational method, showed their contradictions, showed they were written by men, not dictated by God, showed that prophets were just imaginative men who lived in specific times and spoke to specific audiences. They weren't receptacles of eternal truth. They were historical figures trying to influence their contemporaries. And Moses didn't receive the tablets of law directly from God. Moses was a skillful political leader who used religion as a tool of social control. There's nothing wrong with that. It was effective, created cohesion in a dispersed people, but it's not revealed truth. It's politics dressed in theology. And Adam never existed. He's a literary character. He's a mythic figure. He's the archetypal man who represents all humanity. He's useful as symbol, but he's disastrous as history. These ideas were explosive. The treatise was published anonymously, but everyone knew who the author was, and everyone knew what he was doing. He was undermining the foundations of all revealed religion. He was saying there's no revelation. There's only human interpretation of human experiences. The reactions were violent. Spinoza was called atheist, blasphemer, agent of the devil. His books were banned. He was threatened with prison, with death. But he didn't retreat, didn't retract, simply continued writing, continued thinking, continued developing his vision of a world without personal divinity, without miracles, without prophecy, without Adam. And the interesting thing is that this vision didn't lead to nihilism, didn't lead to despair. It led to a strange form of optimism, because if there's no personal God judging our actions, if there's no hell waiting for sinners, if there's no heaven reserved for the just, then what matters is this life. This life is everything, and we must live it in the best way possible. And what's the best way possible? For Spinoza, it was seeking knowledge, seeking to understand nature, seeking to understand oneself, seeking relationships based on rational love instead of emotional dependence, seeking active joys instead of passive pleasures, seeking to increase one's own power of acting instead of diminishing it with sad passions, and doing this not by divine commandment, not by fear of punishment, not by hope of reward, but simply because it's what a rational being does, because it's what suits our nature when adequately understood. Spinoza saw humans as beings in transition between the pure animal, guided only by instincts, and the pure rational being, guided only by adequate understanding. Most were in the middle, part animal, part rational, part slave to passions, part free by reason. And life was this constant struggle between the two aspects of our nature. But it wasn't struggle between good and evil in the metaphysical sense. It was struggle between ignorance and knowledge, between passions that weaken us and actions that strengthen us, between being determined by poorly understood external causes and being determined by our own adequately known nature. And Adam, in this vision, represented the moment when humanity became aware of this struggle. The moment when we realized there's a difference between blindly following impulses and rationally choosing what to do. But the story interprets this wrong, interprets as if there was a prior state of innocence from which we fell, when in fact there never was innocence. There was only unconsciousness, and what we call fall was actually an awakening, a painful, confusing but necessary awakening, and the expulsion from Eden. It was expulsion from animal unconsciousness to human consciousness. It was realizing we're mortal, that we need to work to survive, that we have to deal with pain, with fear, with anguish. But it was also gaining the capacity to understand, to create, to transform the world, to seek something beyond mere survival. So Adam didn't fall. Adam ascended from animality to humanity. And yes, this ascension came with costs, came with new sufferings, but it also came with new possibilities. And one of these possibilities is the rational freedom Spinoza proposed, the freedom to live according to truth instead of according to illusion. In 1677, Spinoza was dying. He was only 44 years old, but his lungs were destroyed. Years of inhaling glass dust while grinding lenses had taken their toll. He knew he didn't have much time. And yet, he worked on the ethics, his masterwork, which was still not complete, worked as if he could finish, as if he could leave his legacy before departing. His friends visited him, worried about him, offered comfort, offered prayers. But Spinoza didn't want prayers. He didn't believe there was anyone listening. He didn't believe his death would be different from the death of any other being. It would simply be a finite mode ceasing to exist. The substance would continue. The universe would continue. But Baruch Spinoza, this particular configuration of matter and motion, this specific expression of the infinite substance, would disappear forever, and he was at peace with this, not because he had hope of life after death, but because he understood that his individual existence was just a wave in the ocean. When the wave dissolves, the water doesn't disappear. It returns to the ocean. It was always in the ocean, and Spinoza knew he was like the wave. His form was temporary, but his substance was eternal. In his last days, he talked with his friends about the nature of man, about how humanity had misunderstood itself for so long, about how it had created mythologies to deal with its fears instead of facing truth, and about how this strategy, although understandable, had led to so much unnecessary suffering. Because when you believe you're a fallen being, that you carry original guilt, that you need external salvation, you live in constant inadequacy. You live feeling you're not good enough, that you need to redeem yourself, that you need to obey, pray, sacrifice, deny yourself. And this generates a diminished life, a life lived with fear, with guilt, with shame. But when you understand there's no fall, that there's no original guilt, that you're simply a necessary expression of nature doing what nature does, then you free yourself. You free yourself from the need for redemption because you were never lost. You free yourself from guilt because you understand you act according to your nature. You free yourself from fear of divine punishment because you understand there's no divine judge waiting to judge you, and this is not license to do whatever you want. Because Spinoza wasn't proposing unbridled hedonism, he was proposing rationality. He was saying that when you adequately understand your nature, when you form clear ideas about what strengthens and what weakens you, you naturally act virtuously. Not by obedience, but by understanding. And the more you understand, the freer you become, more capable of acting according to your own essence instead of being thrown by passions like a leaf in the wind. more capable of experiencing genuine joys instead of fleeting pleasures, more capable of forming healthy relationships based on rational love instead of emotional dependence. This was Spinoza's promise, not salvation in another world, but fulfillment in this one, not personal immortality, but participation in the eternity of substance, not God as loving Father, but God as necessary nature of which we are inseparable part. And Adam was obstacle to this understanding, because as long as we believed in Adam, we would believe there's something wrong with us, that we need to be fixed, that we need to return to an original state of perfection that never existed, and this would prevent us from accepting our nature as it is and working with it instead of against it. So Spinoza dedicated his last days to writing about this, about the necessity of abandoning Adam, about the necessity of understanding the natural origin of man, about the necessity of seeing ourselves as part of nature, not as special beings created in God's image and separated from the rest of creation by a metaphysical abyss. He knew these ideas wouldn't be well received. He knew they would be rejected, attacked, suppressed. But he also knew he couldn't do otherwise, because for him, truth wasn't a matter of choice. It was a matter of necessity. He saw truth and couldn't not see it, and seeing it, couldn't not say it, even if this cost everything. And it cost. It cost his community, his family, his health, his life. But Spinoza didn't regret it, because he had something most people never have, absolute clarity about what matters. And what mattered was truth, not comfortable truth, not convenient truth, but truth as it is, without adornments, without consolation, without false promises. On February 21st, 1677, a Sunday, Spinoza died. He died alone, without family, without religious rituals, without last confession. His body was buried in a common grave. His Jewish community didn't mourn him. The Christian community didn't acknowledge him. He died as he had lived the last 20 years, as a ghost, as someone who existed, but whom no one wanted to admit existed. But he left his writings, and these writings, slowly over decades and centuries, began to influence, began to change how people thought about God, about man, about nature, began to undermine the certainties of traditional religion, began to open the way for a more naturalistic, more rational, more honest worldview. And today, more than 3 centuries after his death, we live in a world that Spinoza helped create, a world where science explains the origin of species without resorting to God, a world where we can question scriptures without fear of being burned, a world where it's possible to live without religion and still have ethics, have purpose, have joy. Not everything Spinoza foresaw came true. Religion didn't disappear as he perhaps hoped. People didn't all become rational, all free, all enlightened. Most still live according to imagination, according to passions, according to inherited beliefs. And perhaps it will always be so. Perhaps Spinoza's philosophy is really only for a few, but these few exist. There are people who can live without the crutches of religious illusions. There are people who can look at the universe in its indifferent vastness and not despair, but marvel. There are people who can accept their finitude without needing to invent fantasies of immortality. And for these people, Spinoza left a path, left a method, left a philosophy that says, you don't need Adam, you don't need fall, you don't need salvation, you need only understanding. And this understanding is available. It's not in mystical revelations, it's not in sacred texts, it's in the very nature of things, waiting to be discovered by any mind willing to think with clarity and courage. And the fascinating thing is that this philosophy, however cold it may seem at first glance, has its own kind of warmth, has its own kind of beauty, because there's something deeply comforting in knowing you don't need to be saved, in knowing you're not broken, in knowing you are exactly what you should be, a necessary expression of the infinite substance, doing what your nature determines you to do. This is not fatalism. It's not passive resignation. Because Spinoza also said that within necessity there's space for growth, there's space to increase knowledge, there's space to transform passive passions into active actions, there's space to become freer, not in the sense of escaping necessity, but in the sense of understanding it so well that you act spontaneously, according to your own nature, instead of being determined by poorly understood external causes. And this journey, This journey from imaginative knowledge to rational knowledge and finally to intuitive knowledge, this journey is the true purpose of human life, according to Spinoza. There's no other purpose given from outside. There's no divine plan for you. There's no special destiny waiting. There's only the possibility of understanding more and more, of becoming freer and freer, of experiencing more and more genuine joy. And in the end, when death comes, as it necessarily comes for all, you don't need to be afraid, because you understand that death is just transformation. It's just a finite mode ceasing to exist, but the substance from which you're made doesn't disappear. It continues. It was always here. It always will be. And you, while you existed, were part of it. You were the infinite substance knowing itself through you. You were God experiencing a particular point of view. You were the universe becoming conscious of itself in a specific form, and this, for Spinoza, was enough. Didn't need to be eternal as individual. It was enough to have existed, enough to have understood, enough to have experienced that special kind of joy that comes from seeing things as they really are, without illusions, without fantasies, without fear. After Spinoza's death, his friends collected his manuscripts. They knew they had something valuable in their hands, something dangerous, something that could change the world or be destroyed before having a chance to circulate. The ethics was almost complete. Only some final touches were missing, and there were other writings, letters, fragments, that together formed a complete and radical philosophical system. They decided to publish everything, anonymously, without identifying the author, without identifying the editors, without identifying the place of publication. They just put it in the world and waited. Waited to see if it would be ignored, if it would be destroyed, if it would be understood. The first reactions were of horror. The ethics was immediately banned. It was called an accursed book, work of the devil, poison for the soul. Respectable philosophers wrote against it. Theologians denounced it from pulpits. Civil authorities prohibited it. Possessing a copy was dangerous. Reading was risky. Admitting agreement was intellectual suicide. But the book circulated, secretly, in private circles, among those willing to risk, and those who read it were transformed, because it was impossible to read Spinoza and remain the same. His ideas had the quality of being irrefutable once understood. They could be rejected, they could be ignored, but they couldn't be undone from the mind, and especially the idea about Adam, the idea that man was not created at a specific moment by a specific divine act, that man emerged gradually from nature, that there's no fall to lament, no paradise to recover, no original sin to redeem. This idea, once planted, grew, spread, undermined the foundations of all Christian and Jewish theology, because if there's no Adam, there's no need for Christ, no need for redemption, no need for church as intermediary between man and God, no need for sacraments, confession, penance. The entire religious structure collapses, and in its place remains only the individual, alone before nature, trying to understand their own existence without revealed manuals, without infallible authorities, without promises of salvation. This was terrifying for most, but liberating for some. And these some, over the following centuries, built upon the foundations Spinoza had laid. They built increasingly naturalistic philosophies. They built sciences that explained more and more phenomena without resorting to supernatural causes. They built increasingly secular societies, where religion was a private matter, not the basis of political power. And in the 19th century, something extraordinary happened. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, and suddenly, what Spinoza had intuited philosophically was being demonstrated empirically. Man really wasn't created. Man really emerged gradually from simpler life forms. Adam really was myth, not history. The reaction was similar to the reaction against Spinoza: horror, denunciation, prohibition. But this time there was too much evidence. There were fossils, there was comparative anatomy, there was geographic distribution of species, there was artificial selection in domestic plants and animals. There were mountains of data pointing to the same conclusion: life evolves. And humanity is no exception. And with Darwin, Spinoza's vision finally became mainstream science. Not that Darwin had read Spinoza, not that he was Spinozist, but he reached the same conclusions by a different path. And together, Spinoza and Darwin demolished Adam. They made it impossible for any educated, and intellectually honest person to continue believing in the literal story of creation. But the story of Adam didn't die, because stories don't die easily, especially stories that serve deep psychological functions. So the story was reinterpreted, it was allegorized, it was spiritualized. Sophisticated theologians said, of course we don't believe Adam was literally created from clay, but the story represents spiritual truths about the human condition. It represents man's alienation from God. It represents freedom and responsibility. It represents the possibility of moral choice. And Spinoza, if he were alive, would say, yes, it represents these things, but not because they're eternal truths revealed by God. It represents because they're human projections. They're ways we found to give meaning to our experience. And there's no problem with that, as long as we don't confuse projection with reality, as long as we don't take the map for the territory. The danger, according to Spinoza, lies in taking stories literally, in believing there really is a personal God who created Adam, who cares about our actions, who will judge us after death. Because this belief leads to bad consequences. It leads to religious intolerance, because if you believe you have revealed truth, any disagreement is heresy. It leads to religious wars, because if God is on your side, killing infidels is sacred act. It leads to repression of science, because if the Bible says something and science contradicts it, science must be wrong. And it leads to diminished lives. It leads people to deny their natural desires because they believe those desires are sinful. It leads people to live in fear of eternal punishment. It leads people to waste this life, the only life they have, in preparation for a future life that will never come. Spinoza wanted to free people from this. He wanted them to see that this life is everything, that there's no reward or punishment waiting, that we can and should seek joy here and now, that our desires aren't sins, they're natural expressions of our essence, that our body isn't the soul's prison, it's part of who we are. That death isn't punishment, it's simply the natural end of all finite existence. And above all, he wanted people to understand they don't need salvation, because they were never lost. They were always part of nature, always were modes of the infinite substance, and the task is not to return to some original state of perfection. The task is to adequately understand what we already are and always have been. But this message was hard to accept, still is, because there's something deeply consoling about the idea of Adam, about the idea that we were created specially, that there's a divine purpose for us, that we're not alone in an indifferent universe, but loved by a creator who cares about every detail of our lives. Spinoza didn't deny the comfort of this belief, didn't deny that it helps many people endure suffering, but he said, it's comfort bought at high price, bought at the cost of truth, bought at the cost of freedom, bought at the cost of living according to illusions instead of according to reality. And he believed we could do better, that we could face truth without falling apart, that we could find meaning and joy even without personal God, even without life after death, even without cosmic purpose for our existence, that we could live well simply by understanding our nature and acting according to it. This was his bet, his philosophical bet, and he lived this bet to the end. He lived without regretting having abandoned the Jewish community. He lived without converting to Christianity out of convenience. He lived without feigning beliefs he didn't have. He lived, as far as possible, according to reason, and he died at peace, without fear, without regret. And his life is proof that it's possible, proof that one can live without Adam, without fall, without redemption, without heaven or hell, just with naked truth, and not just live, but live well, live with clarity, live with integrity. Live with that special kind of joy that comes from knowing you're being honest with yourself and with the world. But Spinoza also recognized that this path wasn't for everyone. He recognized that most people need stories, need symbols, need religions that speak to imagination and heart. And he didn't condemn these people. He didn't see them as inferior. He saw them simply as different, as people who need other types of truth, imaginative and moral truths, not rational and philosophical truths. The problem was when these imaginative truths were imposed by force, when they were used to suppress free thought, when they were transformed into inviolable dogmas that no one could question under penalty of persecution. This, for Spinoza, was intolerable. This he fought with all his forces, and that's why he wrote the theological political treatise. to defend freedom of thought, to show that scriptures shouldn't be interpreted literally, to show that philosophy and theology have different domains and shouldn't interfere with each other, to show that the state should be secular, not theocratic. These ideas were revolutionary, and they took centuries to be partially implemented. But today we live in societies that, to a large extent, follow these principles. We have freedom of thought. We have separation between church and state. We have the right to question, to doubt, to disagree without fear of being burned or excommunicated. And we owe this in part to Spinoza, to this solitary man who dared to think the unthinkable, who dared to question Adam, who dared to reimagine the origin of man without resorting to divine creation, who dared to propose that we're just nature, part of the great cosmic flow of causes and effects, without special purpose, without particular destiny, but with the capacity to understand and, understanding, to become free. And this freedom, Spinozist freedom, is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It's not the freedom to ignore the consequences of your actions. It's not the freedom of arbitrary whim. It's the freedom to act according to your own adequately understood nature. It's the freedom not to be slave to passions. It's the freedom to live rationally, to live with knowledge, to live with that serene joy that comes from being in harmony with universal necessity. And the path to this freedom passes through abandoning Adam, passes through abandoning the idea that there's something wrong with us, passes through accepting that we are what we are, no more, no less, finite modes of the infinite substance, waves in the cosmic ocean, temporary existences but no less real or valuable for being temporary. Spinoza saw beauty in this, saw dignity in this, saw reason to live fully in this, because if this life is everything, then every moment matters, every experience of joy is precious, every genuine relationship is sacred in its own way. Every moment of understanding is a victory over ignorance, over fear, over superstition, and he believed that the more people understood this, the more the world would improve. Not by divine intervention, not by miracles, but simply because rational people, people who understand their own nature, tend to cooperate, tend to seek the common good, tend to create more just and freer societies, not because they're morally superior, but because they understand their own good is linked to the good of others, that it's impossible to be genuinely happy in an unhappy society, that our nature is such that we prosper when we cooperate, when we help each other, when we build together, and all this without need for divine commandments, without need for threats of hell or promises of heaven, just through rational understanding of how things are. And this was Spinoza's radical bet, that reason is sufficient, that knowledge is sufficient, that truth, however cold it may be, is better than any illusion, however consoling it may be. And for those who can accept this bet, who can live according to this philosophy, Spinoza promised something extraordinary. He promised beatitude, not the beatitude of Christian heaven, not the beatitude of mystical union with personal God, but the beatitude of adequate knowledge, the beatitude of understanding your position in the cosmos, the beatitude of intellectually loving the totality of what exists. And this beatitude, he said, is eternal, not in the sense of lasting forever in time, but in the sense of participating in God's eternity. Because when you adequately understand something, when you see the necessity with which things are as they are, you're seeing with the eyes of the infinite substance. You're knowing things from the perspective of eternity. And this perspective doesn't die when you die, because it was never personal, it was always universal. This is hard to understand. It's perhaps the most obscure part of Spinoza's philosophy, but he insisted on it. Insisted there's a form of eternity accessible to us here and now. No need to wait to die. No need to reach altered mystical state of consciousness. Just need to understand. Understand rationally. Understand geometrically. Understand with the same necessity with which you understand that the sum of angles in a triangle is 180 degrees. And the more you understand, the more eternal you become. The more you participate in the infinite substance, not just as passive mode, but as active mode, as mode that knows, that understands, that sees, and in this seeing is the greatest possible joy, the joy of knowledge, the joy of truth, the joy of being conscious part of the whole. And Adam was obstacle to this joy, because as long as we believed in Adam, we would believe we are separated from the whole, that we fell, that we need to return, that there's distance between us and God. But for Spinoza, there's no distance, there never was. We were always part of God. We were always modes of the single substance. We were always at home, even when we felt lost. And realizing this is the end of the spiritual journey according to Spinoza, there's no place to arrive. There's no state to achieve. There's only recognition of what was always true. You are nature. You are God. You are everything, and everything is you. And in this perception, all unnecessary suffering dissolves. Only the inevitable suffering of being finite remains. And even this suffering loses its sting when adequately understood. In the centuries following Spinoza's death, his philosophy was both celebrated and demonized. German romantics adored him, saw him as mystical pantheist who identified God with nature. French materialists claimed him, saw him as proto-atheist who disguised his atheism with religious language. Idealists interpreted him as precursor, as someone who prepared ground for more complex systems, and all were partially right and partially wrong, because Spinoza wasn't easily classifiable. He wasn't theist in the traditional sense, but also wasn't atheist. He wasn't materialist in the reductionist sense, but also wasn't idealist in the Platonic sense. He was simply Spinozist. He had his own unique system, irreducible to established categories. But there was one aspect of his thought that everyone recognized: his radical rejection of the story of Adam, his insistence that man was not created specially, his vision that we're natural products of natural processes. And this, more than anything else, made him a dangerous figure for religious institutions, because without Adam, all traditional Christian theology collapses. The doctrine of original sin loses foundation. The necessity of Christ as Redeemer becomes questionable. The authority of the Church as guardian of salvation is undermined. Everything becomes optional, interpretive, symbolic. And this is unacceptable for religions based on revealed truths and infallible dogmas. So Spinoza continued being dangerous, continued being prohibited, continued being the name that must not be mentioned. And when mentioned, it was to condemn, to use as example of how far reason can lead when divorced from faith. He was the philosophical scarecrow, the warning of what happens when you think too much, when you question too much, when you doubt too much. But for a growing minority, Spinoza was hero. He was the man who dared to speak truth, who preferred exile and poverty to hypocrisy, who lived with absolute integrity to the end. And this minority over the centuries grew, became mainstream, transformed the world. Today, in the 21st century, we live in a world that would have astonished people of the 17th century. We live in a world where evolutionary theory is taught in schools, where the natural origin of man is established scientific fact, where questioning the literalness of the Bible doesn't lead to the stake, where it's possible to live openly without religion and still be a respectable citizen. And this world owes much to Spinoza. Not that he alone caused these changes, but he was one of the first to articulate clearly and systematically a completely naturalistic worldview. A vision where God is not personal creator but impersonal substance, where man is not special creature but finite mode, where there are no miracles, just nature operating according to its necessary laws. And once this vision was articulated, once it was placed in the world with philosophical clarity and precision, it couldn't be undone. It could be rejected, it could be fought, but it couldn't be ignored. And slowly, inexorably, it gained ground. It infiltrated the minds of philosophers, scientists, artists, freethinkers. It changed how people saw the world, and the story of Adam was one of the first victims of this change. Because once you accept that man evolved from simpler life forms, that there's continuity between us and other animals, that we share ancestors with chimpanzees, with all mammals, with all living beings, then Adam becomes obviously mythical, obviously symbolic, obviously non-historical. And with Adam's fall also falls the entire theological structure built upon him. Original sin falls, the necessity of redemption falls, the exclusivity of Christ as Savior falls, the authority of the Church as guardian of revealed truth falls. Everything becomes more fluid, more interpretive, more personal. And this is precisely what Spinoza wanted. He wanted each person to think for themselves, to form their own ideas about God, about the world, about themselves. Not to accept anything by authority, but only by rational understanding. To be free to seek truth wherever it is, without fear of heresy, without fear of excommunication, without fear of eternal damnation. And today, at least in liberal democratic societies, we have this freedom. We have the right to question, to doubt, to disagree, to form our own philosophies of life. And this is direct heritage of the Enlightenment, of which Spinoza was precursor. It's heritage of the courage of those who dared to think freely, when thinking freely was capital crime. But Spinoza's vision of the origin of man wasn't just negative. It wasn't just rejecting Adam. It was also proposing something in its place. And what he proposed was a vision of human dignity based not on special creation, but on participation in infinite nature. We're worthy not because we were created in God's image, but because we're modes of God. Because we're the infinite substance expressing itself in finite form. Because we're nature becoming conscious of itself. And this, for Spinoza, was more impressive, more wonderful, more worthy of admiration than any story of special creation. Because creating is act of will, is contingent act, is act that might not have happened. But necessary existence is different. It's existence that couldn't not be. It's existence that flows from the very essence of substance. It's existence that is expression of the infinite in the finite, of the eternal in the temporal, of the necessary in the particular. And we are this, each of us, not by divine choice, not by celestial whim, but by absolute necessity. We couldn't not exist. Given the state of the universe that led to our existence, we're as necessary as the orbit of planets, as inevitable as gravity, as natural as starlight. And there's something deeply comforting in this vision. Something that answers existential anguish differently from traditional religion, but no less effectively. Because religion says, you're special, you're loved, you have purpose given by God. And this consoles, but it also creates anxiety. What if I disappoint God? What if I don't fulfill my purpose? What if I'm condemned? Spinoza says, you're not special in the sense of being unique, but you're also not insignificant. You're necessary mode of the infinite substance. You can't disappoint because there are no expectations. You can't fail because there's no test. You can't be condemned because there's no judge. You simply are. And being, you participate in eternity. And this is sufficient. This message is difficult. It's cold at first glance. But it has its own form of warmth, has its own form of love. Not the personal love of a celestial father, but the impersonal love of totality. The love that nature has for all its forms. The love that the ocean has for each wave. The love that the infinite has for each finite. And feeling this love, understanding this love, is what Spinoza called intellectual love of God. It's seeing your own existence not as accident, not as test, not as punishment or reward, but as necessary expression of the whole, as note in the cosmic symphony, as word in the universal poetry. And when you see this, when you understand this, then Adam becomes irrelevant. Because you don't need special origin story. Your origin is the origin of everything. It's the eternal substance manifesting. It's God becoming you. And this is sufficient origin, is sufficient dignity, is sufficient reason to live with joy, with purpose, with gratitude. Not gratitude to someone, because there's no one to thank, but gratitude as state of being, gratitude for existing, gratitude for being able to experience, gratitude for being able to know, gratitude for being conscious part of the whole instead of just unconscious part. And this gratitude, according to Spinoza, is the highest form of religiosity, higher than any ritual, higher than any prayer, higher than any sacrifice, because it's gratitude born from understanding, not from ignorance. That's born from truth, not from illusion. That's born from rational love of the whole, not from servile fear of a capricious God. The story of Adam served for millennia as explanation for human suffering. Why do we feel pain? Why do we die? Why is the world hard and cruel? The answer was simple. Because Adam sinned. Because we fell. Because we deserve punishment. This narrative worked. It gave meaning to absurdity. It transformed tragedy into divine justice. Spinoza saw this as fundamental error. Suffering doesn't need moral justification. It's not punishment. It's simply part of finite existence. Every finite being is subject to external forces. Every finite being can be destroyed by causes it doesn't control. This is not cosmic injustice. It's just nature operating. The child who dies of disease is not being punished for Adam's sin. The failing harvest is not divine punishment. The earthquake that destroys cities is not moral judgment. They're just natural events flowing from natural causes according to necessary laws. There's no will behind it, no purpose, no lesson. And accepting this, according to Spinoza, is liberating, because it frees from the need to find moral meaning in every tragedy. It frees from the guilt of thinking we suffer because we deserve it. It frees from resentment against God for allowing injustices, because there's no personal God permitting or prohibiting. There's just nature being nature. But this doesn't mean fatalism. It doesn't mean we should passively accept everything that happens. It means we should understand causes and act rationally to increase our power to persevere. If there's disease, seek cure. If there's hunger, cultivate food. If there's ignorance, seek knowledge. Not because God commands, but because it suits our nature. And the interesting thing is that this vision, although it seems cold, led Spinoza to very human ethical positions. He was against death penalty, against torture, against all kinds of cruelty. Not because they were sins against God, but because they diminished human power to exist, because they went against man's rational nature, because they generated sadness instead of joy. Spinozist ethics wasn't based on commandments. It was based on understanding human nature, and from human nature followed that certain things strengthen us and others weaken us. Things that strengthen us are good, things that weaken us are bad, not by divine decree, but by natural necessity. Spinoza died leaving questions unanswered. How exactly did man arise from nature? What was the process? How long did it take? These questions would only be answered centuries later with Darwin and modern biology. But Spinoza established the principle: seek natural explanations. Don't resort to miracles. Don't invoke God as explanation for what you don't understand. This principle was revolutionary, because before it, any unexplained phenomenon was attributed to God. Lightning, God is angry. Earthquakes, God is punishing. Diseases, God is testing. And whenever something good happened too, God blessed us. God heard our prayers. God chose us. But Spinoza said, God doesn't choose. God doesn't hear. God doesn't intervene. Because God is nature, and nature operates by necessity, not by will. So seek to understand necessity. Seek natural causes. Seek the laws that govern phenomena, and you'll find better answers than any theology. And when Darwin finally explained the origin of species by natural selection, when he showed how complexity can emerge from simple processes operating for sufficient time, when he demonstrated there's no need for intelligent designer, he was empirically confirming what Spinoza had philosophically anticipated. Man was not created. He evolved, gradually, through blind processes, through mutation and selection, through adaptation to environment. And at each stage it was completely natural. There was no magic moment where animal became man. There were just gradual changes accumulating over millions of years until characteristics we call human emerged. And what about consciousness? This was the last refuge of those who wanted to keep something special in man. They said, yes, perhaps the body evolved, but the soul was breathed by God. Consciousness is divine. Spinoza disagreed. For him, consciousness was just greater degree of complexity, not different substance. Every being has conatus, impulse to persevere. In stones it's minimal, in plants greater, in animals even greater. In man it reaches levels that permit reflection, planning, abstract language. But it's difference of degree, not of type. There's no metaphysical leap. There's only natural continuity, and this meant there's no immortal soul separable from body. Mind is body seen from within. Body is mind seen from without. They're aspects of the same thing. When body dies, mind dies. There's no personal survival, no judgment after death. There's only return to substance as wave returns to ocean. But Spinoza offered something in return: eternity in the present. Each moment of adequate understanding participates in God's eternity. No need to wait to die. Eternity is here now in the very structure of true knowledge, and this was sufficient for those who could understand it. Spinoza's legacy on the origin of man was complex. For centuries it was suppressed, rejected, feared, but slowly it infiltrated Western thought. It prepared ground for Darwin, It prepared ground for modern neuroscience that sees mind as brain function. It prepared ground for secularism that doesn't need God to explain the world. And especially, it freed us from Adam. It freed us from the need to believe we're fallen creatures needing redemption. It freed us from original guilt. It freed us from fear of eternal punishment for being what we are. And it offered in return different dignity, the dignity of being necessary part of the whole. Today, when we look at fossils of human ancestors, when we study DNA and see kinship with all living beings, when we understand evolution, we're seeing the world with Spinozist eyes. We're seeing natural origin without needing supernatural creator. And millions do this without knowing they owe this vision partially to an excommunicated Jew from the 17th century. Spinoza didn't completely win. Religions still exist. Adam is still taught as literal history by many, but the intellectual battle was won. No educated person today can literally believe in man's creation from clay. And this is Spinoza's victory as much as Darwin's. But what did we lose by abandoning Adam? We lost story that gave meaning to suffering. We lost narrative that placed us at center of cosmos. We lost comfort of being specially loved by personal creator. We lost promise of life after death. We lost hope of reuniting with loved ones. We lost cosmic justice that would punish the wicked and reward the good. Spinoza would say, yes, we lost all that, but they were illusions. They were false consolations. And the price of keeping them was living in ignorance, in fear, in unnecessary guilt. The price was denying our nature. The price was wasting this life waiting for another. The price was submitting to religious authorities who controlled through fear. And what did we gain? We gained truth. We gained freedom to think for ourselves. We gained capacity to live without guilt for being what we are. We gained possibility of finding joy here and now without waiting for future heaven. We gained moral autonomy based on rational understanding instead of blind obedience. For Spinoza, it was worthwhile trade, but he recognized it wasn't for everyone. Most will always prefer comfort of illusion to discomfort of truth, and that's okay. What's not acceptable is imposing illusion by force. It's prohibiting questioning. It's persecuting those who think differently. And it was against this that Spinoza fought until the end. 3.5 centuries after Spinoza, where are we? We live in world he helped create. World where science explains natural origin of man, where it's possible to live without religion, where questioning doesn't lead to stake, but also world where his warnings are still relevant. Because there's still temptation to seek absolute certainties. There's still temptation to create new Adams, new original narratives that explain everything. There's still temptation to divide world into absolute good and evil. And Spinoza reminds us, distrust certainties. Distrust those who claim to have final truth. Distrust those who promise salvation. The only real salvation is knowledge. It's ever greater understanding of ourselves and the world. It's freeing ourselves from passions that enslave us by forming increasingly adequate ideas. It's increasing our power to exist and to act. It's living according to reason instead of according to fear or hope. And what about Adam? Adam can remain as symbol, a story that teaches something about human condition, as metaphor for our self-consciousness that separates us from animal innocence, but not as literal history, not as foundation of theology, not as real explanation of our origin. Our origin is nature entire. It's billions of years of cosmic evolution. It's stars dying and creating elements that form our bodies. It's life emerging from chemistry. It's consciousness emerging from complexity. It's majestic, terrible, beautiful process, completely natural. And participating in this process, understanding it, marveling at it, is religiosity deeper than any worship of personal God. This was Spinoza's final message, and it remains relevant, remains challenging, remains true. We don't need Adam. We never needed. We were always part of nature. And the sooner we accept this, the sooner we live according to this truth, the freer, the more joyful, the more fulfilled we'll become. And thus ends the natural genesis of man, according to Spinoza, not with promised salvation, not with paradise recovered, but with understanding achieved, with truth faced, with freedom conquered. And for those with courage to accept, this is more than sufficient. It's everything.